Hi there, my name is Wayne Dixon and thanks for joining me in this course called Directing the Camera. So what is this course about and what isn't it about? Well, first of all, putting together your own short film, which is probably something that you want to do, is a really big mammoth task, and there's many different steps and many different areas. So rather than create a course that goes into minimal depth about each one of those steps, I'm narrowing down the focus in this course and we're going to go into depth about one of those things that you need to know about, which is the camera. So that's what this course is all about. Everything you need to know about the camera for when you're putting together your own short film. We'll look at some stuff from still photography as well as cinematography. You'll learn the real physics on how cameras actually work and the differences between the software version and the real world. Some of it is the same, some of it you don't need to worry about, and some of it is just cool to know. This is all to hopefully help you make better decisions when you're actually going ahead and making your own short films. So I hope you enjoy this course as much as I have enjoyed putting it together. So thanks for joining me.
One of the great things about a 3D scene is you're not limited by the physical reality. Almost anything is possible, and we can move our camera anywhere. However, this is one of the problems. Because we're not limited by the physical reality, it's really easy to move your camera in an unbelievable way. But if you know a little bit about how things are done in the real world, it's really going to help your project look better. So before you start your animated project, let's learn some of the basics about camera moves. Here's a model of a camera. If it's unrestrained, we have what's called 6 degrees of freedom. That is, it can move, or I'll use the term translate, on its 3 axes, and it can also rotate on those same 3 axes. That gives us 6 degrees of freedom, which is also called 6 degrees of motion. Now, each one of these moves has a technical name. If you translate your camera forward and backwards, that is called a dolly. Side to side is called a truck. Up and down is called a pedestal. If you rotate to the left and the right, that is called a pan. If you rotate up and down, that is called a tilt. And if you rotate from the side, that is called a roll. So that's our 6 degrees of movement. Dolly, truck, pedestal, pan, tilt, roll. Now that you know the technical names, you can actually start using them and sound like a professional, rather than what you used to call each one of these moves. Now let's talk about some of the different types of mounts a camera can be attached to. A mount will restrict all or some of the camera's actual movements.
Now the first mount is no mount at all. This is handheld, where the camera is held by a person, giving it all those 6 degrees of motion, and it's often intentionally shaky, which is something quite hard to do in 3D, but we'll have a look at that a little bit later on in the course.
Now probably the most common mount would be a tripod, and that restricts most of the movement and it just allows the camera to pan or tilt. Everything else is generally locked off. And getting more fancy, we have a dolly camera, also known as a dolly rig or a dolly. This is often put on a track so that we can get smooth movement as people push the camera along the track. Yes, people do push it manually, but it doesn't have to go on a track. It can actually just go on the ground as well. One of the coolest mounts would probably be the Steadicam, which you can see here is held by one of the CG Cookie creators, Jonathan Williamson. It's actually not Jonathan, but it looks a lot like him. Now, Steadicam actually just smooths out the movement, so the person is free to run around and point the camera wherever, but it just does its best to stabilize the view. Here is a shot of a crane or a boom rig. This is where the camera is mounted on the end of the crane, so it can get some height. These generally move in a nice arc. And of course, cameras can actually be mounted to many different things that I haven't mentioned here, like drones, helicopters, to get aerial shots. On this guy on a Segway, you can mount them to people or a helmet, or even cars or vehicles. You've probably seen dash cams. Some people actually get creative out there by putting a camera on a skateboard or this tripod rollerblade contraption thing here. It's not possible for me to explain all the different types of mount, and that's not the main point of what I want to explain in this video. What I want you to do is anytime that you need to move your camera in a 3D project, I want you to think about what it's actually mounted on and how that thing is going to move. If you do that, you are going to get a much better result than just trying to animate it in the scene without thinking about it.
Now there's 2 more things I want to talk about, and that is zoom and focus, which aren't technically moves, although they could be, but they are camera techniques. Firstly, the rack focus. That is where we change the focus of the camera to draw the viewer's eye to something that we want them to pay attention to. That is a rack focus. Then we have a zoom. Now zooming is where the camera stays still and the focal length changes to zoom in or out on the shot. We'll go more into focal length and what it is later on. But the most famous type of zoom is the dolly zoom, which is also called a Hitchcock zoom. This is where we move the camera and we zoom at the same time. I'll show you how to do this later on the course, so look forward to that. One other type of zoom is the crash zoom, which is often used in comedy or action when it's a really fast-paced zoom to accentuate a certain point. Okay, so that's enough for this lesson for the moment. But before we finish up, I'd like to give you some homework. You're going to like this homework. What I want you to do is watch a movie, a film, a TV, or whatever. And all I want you to do is look for a shot or a scene where the camera is moving, pause it, and then think about how that was physically done. Noticing these camera moves and trying to think about how they did them in the real world is really going to help you make those in 3D. Okay, I'll see you in the next lesson. Where you put your camera and the direction it is facing can have a huge impact on how your film turns out. No duh, Wayne. Anyway, let's continue learning some of the basics and get stuck into camera angles. The eye level shot. This is where the camera is placed at eye level, looking straight ahead. This is the most common height as it mimics the real world. When we look around the world, generally our eye lines are parallel to the ground, and we look at other people at this level. So when you place the camera at this height, it also puts the subject in a neutral perspective. That is where we're not looking up or down at the character, as this can influence the way that we feel about them, which you'll learn in a moment. The low angle shot. A low angle shot is where the camera is looking upwards towards the subject. This can give the impression of dominance to the character, and it can make the subject look bigger or more threatening to the viewer or the other characters in the scene. The high angle shot. This is the opposite to the low angle, where the camera is looking down at the subject. It can make the subject look smaller or inferior. This angle can be subtle or it can be extreme, like an aerial or an overhead shot. The low angles and the high angle shots are often used to create a power struggle between characters to make one feel more powerful than the other. The Dutch angle or the Dutch tilt is where the camera is rolled to the side, creating what's called the Dutch angle. Now there's two directions it can go. It can Dutch left and it can Dutch right. The name is based on the direction that the camera actually physically rolls, not the way that the subject is angled on the screen. The Dutch angle is most often used to show disorientation or something unsettling, but sometimes it's used just to make things look cool. So now that you know how to make something look cool, let's take a look at camera shots in our next lesson. Now that you know how to angle your camera, it's time to learn about some of the basic types of camera shots. So I'm talking about the terminology that describes the visual elements of what's in the frame of the camera. Shots can be classified by three types of things. The size of the field of view, that is how much of your scene you can see. By the camera placement, some of which you've already covered in some of the other lessons. And finally by some other various criteria, of which there are too many to mention, but I'll go through some of the most important ones that you really need to know. In cinematography, there's sometimes different terminology for exactly the same thing. I'll give you the most common terminology, or at least the most common in my experience, as well as a few of the alternate names. Okay, let's look at some basic camera shots. We'll start with the classifications based on the field of view. The extreme long shot, also known as the extreme wide shot. This shows the subject at a distance. It's often used as an establishing shot, and because the subject is generally small on the screen, it isn't really used to show the character's actions or emotions. It's more about showing the scene. In this example, there's not much going on in the background, but that's on purpose. Totally. Getting a little bit closer, we have the long shot, also called the wide shot. Long and wide can be used interchangeably when you're talking about this type of thing. But when you're talking about lenses, that's different. I will talk about that in another lesson. This is a little bit closer than the extreme long, and the characters or the subject is more the focus than the entire scene. But the bigger picture is usually very important in this type of shot. So in the long shot, the full character is visible, although as you can see here, they don't fill up the entire frame. That would be our next shot. This is a full shot, where the entire character is visible from head to toe and they fill up most of the frame. The focus here is the character's actions, as the audience can't really see the character's face all that well. So it's more of a focus on the big broad actions of the character rather than the minute internal emotions going on in their face. Now we're looking at a medium long shot, also known as a medium wide or a 3/4. It's called 3/4 because usually it shows 3/4 of the character, usually from the knees up, but that depends on what type of character that you're using. Now this is a medium shot. In my country, it's usually referred to as a mid shot, but in other countries, it's mainly referred to as a medium shot. This is from the waist up. This is the most common shot you'll see in films because you can see the character really well, and you can also see what's going on in the environment as well. All right, now we're looking at a medium close-up. So the framing here is generally from the chest up, but mainly the face is the focus of this shot. You can really see what's going on with the character. The close-up. A close-up is where you fill the frame with part of your subject. For a character, that is generally the face. It really lets the audience see and feel the character's emotions. And then we have the extreme close-up. This is where we're getting super close. Usually you're just showing part of the character's face, like their mouth or their eyes. So let's go over some other terminology that you might come across and not be aware of what it is. A single, a two-shot, and a three-shot. A single is generally when you have more than one person in the scene, but you just have a single shot of one character from that scene. A two-shot is where you have two characters from that scene. Now here we have the two characters both facing towards the camera, but they can also be posed like this. This is called a two-shot. And obviously a three-shot is just when you have three characters in the scene. Hi Melvin. And just so you know, background characters don't count. It's only the main characters. So if Melvin was just an extra walking in the background, this would only be a two-shot. Now let's look at the over-the-shoulder shot, which is abbreviated to OTS. This is where you place the camera as if it's looking over the shoulder of one of your characters. It shows what the character is looking at, whether that's a person, an object, or a landscape. You'll see this very often when characters are talking to each other. Now you'll probably notice here that the framing looks pretty similar to the two-shot. However, you can see that our blue baker is what we want the audience to be looking at. But having the orange baker here in the frame gives a little foreground to the shot. It frames the shot a little bit better, and it still gives you an indication of who the blue baker is actually talking to. The audience can feel like they're just over the shoulder. See what I did there? Of course you did. Now there's also some variations on over the shoulder, like over the hip or over the head. But as you can imagine, it's just to do with the placement of the camera. The idea of these variations is exactly the same. So you're framing the shot with one character and showing what they're looking at. Okay, moving on. Sorry about this orange baker, but we're about to fly through the back of your head. For the POV. Now the POV stands for point of view. And as the name would suggest, this is where the camera is placed from the point of view of one of your characters or objects. It's like the camera is that character or that object. All right, so a few more terms now. The reaction shot is where you cut to one of the characters doing a reaction to what's going on. So let's just say Blue and Orange Baker are talking to each other, and Blue Baker is actually talking. Then we cut to Orange Baker to see him nodding along, or his reaction to what's being said, where he is not actually talking. Now, a cut away and a cut in are very similar, but it just depends on the subject that you're cutting to. So for example, these guys are talking to each other and we have Melvin in the background, and then the next shot we want to actually show what Melvin is doing. We would cut in because he was in the frame of the earlier shot. So that's a cut in. Although if we go back and he was out of frame and Blue Baker said, "Oh, look over there," and then we cut to Melvin, that is a cut away. So they're pretty similar, just a minute difference there. Now, before we finish up, there's one more thing I'd like to talk about, and that is the establishing shot. This is a super important shot, and it's often overlooked by young filmmakers. So what is the establishing shot? Well, that's a shot at the start of the sequence that establishes to the audience where and when the scene is taking place. This is often a wide shot of the entire scene, and it may or may not have the characters in it from that particular scene. Sometimes the establishing shot is actually the same physical environment where the rest of the scene takes place, but sometimes it just can't be. Often it is the exterior of a building where the scene is actually taking place inside. You'll see this often in sitcoms where they show the exterior of the building that establishes the where and the when, and then they cut to the inside action of what's going on inside that building. So if you're making your own animated short, don't forget about the establishing shot. Alright, so in the last 3 lessons, I've spoken about camera moves, camera angles, and now camera shots, as if they're all separate things, when really they're not. All these things overlap, they intertwine, they work in concert with each other. And as you can probably already tell, some things are not just one thing at once. They can be more than that, all at the same time. Like one shot might start out as a wide and then end up as a close-up. Lines can be blurred and there's gray areas. So don't worry too much about that. All right, so time for some more homework. You're going to like this homework again. So what I want you to do is repeat our last homework assignment, which is where I want you to watch a film, a movie, an animated film, whatever it is, and I want you to look for a few more things. First, look at the entire sequence. Can you see the establishing shot? Did it tell you where and when the scene was taking place? I also want you to pay attention to the other things that you've learned about in these last few videos. Can you spot any of the different frame sizes? Is it a close-up? Is it a wide? Is it a long? Is it an extreme close-up? There's the two shot, the full shot, the mid shot, etc. What height is a camera? Is it low angle, eye level, above? Is it Dutch? Is the camera moving? How is it moving? So in addition to everything that we've spoken about before, there's one more thing that I'd like you to pay attention to, and that is focus. Now, I know we haven't covered focus yet, but we will later. All I want you to do for now is look at what is in focus in the shot. Is it narrow focus to direct the eye to look at a specific thing, or is it a deep focus to show the entire scene? So I don't want you to get too carried away with all the technical things going on here. At the very least, all I want you to do is to start noticing what's going on, because noticing this stuff is really going to help you when you put together your first animated project. Good luck, have fun, and I'll see you in the next lesson. In 3D software, even though we're dealing with the camera and lenses that are based on real-world physics, the camera is actually virtual. So we don't have to worry about all the same things that the real-world camera operator does. So in this video, I'll explain to you only the things that you need to worry about, or at least attempt to. The main things I'll be talking about will be the focal length and how that affects both the field of view and the perspective. And I'll also mainly be talking about focus and depth of field. All those things are kind of related. But first, let's start with lenses. All camera lenses work based on the same principles of physics. When parallel light rays travel through a convex lens, they are refracted inwards to a point. That point is called the focal point, and its distance from the lens is called the focal length. That is what it means when someone says it's a 16mm lens or a 100mm lens. That is this distance here. Now, the human eye physically has a focal point of about 22mm, although that is equivalent of a 50mm camera lens when you're using a full frame sensor. Don't worry, that doesn't make sense to you right now, but it will in a moment. It's got to do with the fact that the retina is smaller than the camera sensor, and even in the virtual world, it's really confusing. Incidentally, did you know that we actually see the world upside down and our brains flip it? That's because it decides that having people dancing on the ceiling isn't a logical way to navigate through the world. Sorry, Lionel. What a feeling, dancing on the ceiling. Okay, back to camera lenses. Now, physically, a single camera lens cannot make a sharp image because the rays that hit the outer edge of the curved lens don't quite meet at the same point as the rays that hit the middle. This is called spherical aberration. And also, when light hits, it can actually split from the red and blue wavelengths. This is called chromatic aberration. Real cameras have lenses with multiple lenses that actually correct for this, but in our beautifully virtual 3D world, we don't have to worry about it. Phew! Now, when you change the focal length of the camera lens, we're actually controlling the zoom and how much is in the field of view. It might look like the camera is getting closer, but we're not. The camera is staying put. Small numbers mean a low zoom and a wide field of view, and large numbers mean a high zoom and a narrow field of view. Now, as I pointed out before, wide and long can be used interchangeably when you're talking about types of camera shots, but when you're talking about lenses, long and wide are the exact opposites of each other. What? So a short lens, or a short focal length, equals a wide field of view, and a long lens, or a long focal length, equals a narrow field of view. Not that it matters, but the way that I remember this is by thinking about the size of the lens. Short and fat is wide, long and skinny is narrow. As the focal length changes, it actually affects the perspective distortion of the view. Now that might sound crazy, but trust me, it's not. For simplicity, let's just lump all of the focal lengths into three categories. We've got our wide, our standard, and our long, which is also called telephoto. Our wide angle lenses is anything less than 35mm. This is good for fitting in a lot into your field of view. That's like a landscape. You might see this on security cameras or reversing cameras, anywhere where you want to fit a lot in. Now, one factor of these wide angle lenses is when things are close to the lens, they look bulbous, and things in the background actually look further away than they really are. And that's why wide angle lenses are not great for close-up selfies. Now, a standard lens is anywhere from about 35 to 70 millimeters, which is close to the human eye. As I mentioned before, it's about 50 millimeters if you were considering the eye being actually a camera. Now with these standard lens, things look relatively normal, which is why you'll see a lot of shows and most of the shots that you'll see will be taken with a standard lens. And then anything above 70 millimeters is classified as a long lens or a telephoto lens. That's where you want to zoom in. Now, when our wide actually made things look bulbous, our long lenses actually distort things in a different way. It actually makes the background look closer than it actually is. Now, this type of length distortion is actually called lens compression, but you'll kind of see this in full effect when we do our dolly zoom later on. Now, before I move on, I also want to point out one of the most popular focal lengths for taking a portrait shot. That would be 85 millimeters. That makes the subject look good, and when you're talking about a physical lens, it has a naturally shallow depth of field, which blurs the background. So it really makes the subject stand out. We'll be going over depth of field later on because it works a little bit differently in 3D, so we won't be covering it exactly like, say, photography. Now, real cameras and the human eye is actually made up of multiple lenses, which makes it possible to control the focal distance. That is, how far away from the camera is something perfectly in focus. That point is called the focal plane. In Blender, we can set this value specifically, or we can actually let the computer focus on a specific object that we tell it to. Now, depth of field is how far in front of that focal plane and behind that focal plane is acceptably in focus. Things beyond this point are too blurry for our brains to figure out. We can actually control the depth of field with the f-stop. So let me explain how the real world works first. Now, the iris restricts the amount of light coming through a lens by rotating the blades to increase or decrease the size of the opening. Now, the iris is the entire mechanical thing. These blades actually called the diaphragm, and the aperture is the opening. The aperture affects the depth of field. That is how much of the image is in focus. And the size of this opening is measured in f-stops. The smaller the f-stop number, the larger the aperture will be, but less of the scene will be in focus. And the larger the f-stop, the smaller the aperture is, but more will be in focus. In real photography, increasing and decreasing the amount of light that hits the sensor actually changes the exposure of the image, that is how bright it is. And the camera operator will need to adjust the ISO and the shutter speed to compensate for this to get the correct exposure on the image. Thankfully, we do not need to worry about that when we're working in 3D. We've just got one number to deal with, and that is the f-stop. But all this talk about f-stops and apertures and stuff can be really confusing, and it's super confusing in the real world of cameras. So I'd like to share with you the most simple explanation I've found. You don't have to worry about all the other stuff. This is a great mental model for the real world of photography, but it lends itself perfectly for us in 3D. The way that I imagine it is that there's a whole bunch of Fs shooting out from the front of your camera. If you think about the depth of field as being a certain section of that, if you want to see more Fs, you increase the f-stop, more will be in focus. Or if you want to see less, you decrease the f-stop and less will be in focus. That's the most simple explanation that I've found. It's also worth pointing out a few things to keep in mind. The size of the depth of field changes when you change both the focal distance and the lens size, as you can see here. Getting smaller when we get closer, and it's getting larger when we get further away. Also, the point that is in perfect focus, that is the focal plane, is about 1/3 of the way through this space and not in the midpoint as you might assume. Blender actually calculates these things based on the real world physics. However, you will often find that your scenes aren't built to real world measurements. That means when you try to take a common setting from the real world camera, say of like an f-stop 2.8, you probably have more than you expect in focus. That is where our virtual camera has some advantages. We are not constrained by the same physical limitations as the real world. So don't worry if it's not the same settings as your real world counterpart. You can tweak this so it achieves the result that you want. So here's what you want to do. Just pick your focal distance and then think about the Fs. The more Fs, the more in focus. The less Fs, the less in focus. Now, the sensor size is only something you need to worry about if you're trying to emulate a specific physical camera, but let me explain how it works. In a camera, the image is projected onto the sensor, which is also called an image plane, which is a different type of image plane that you're used to in 3D. Now, the default sensor size is based on the old 35mm frame size. It's also called full frame. This frame has a physical size of 36mm by 24mm, but the whole entire film strip is 35mm wide. That is where it gets the name from. Okay, so here is some light that is projected onto that image plane. And here is that same 36 by 24mm frame or sensor. This section is what is captured by the camera at the resolution that you've set. When you're changing the sensor size, you're actually cropping or overscanning what is on that virtual image plane. So even though when you change the sensor size, it looks like you're zooming the image, you technically aren't. But like I said, just leave this at the default setting unless you're trying to emulate a specific type of camera and lens setup. The final thing I want to mention is the tilt shift lens. These are lenses that help straighten up lines of perspective and also create that effect where real life things look miniature. Tilt shift lenses can change the perspective and rotate the focal plane by manipulating the lens. It can physically shift, that is move left and right, and physically tilt, which is moving up and down, all while keeping the front of the lens parallel with the sensor. We can do the same thing with our virtual camera in Blender, but I'll actually show you how to do this in a fun exercise that I've got planned later in the course. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that now, and later on we'll have some fun with it. So that is the end of this video. I hope you have enjoyed it and learned a lot of stuff, but I'll see you in the next one. Let's have a look at the Add Camera Rigs add-on. The first thing we need to do is make sure that we enable it. So I'm just going to jump over to my preferences here, go to add-on, and then type in add. The add-on is called Add Camera Rigs. At the time of this recording, the current version that ships with Blender is 1.4.3, although I've just done an update which has one extra control, which I'll speak about in this video, but everything else is the same. Hopefully that addition will be available in Blender 2.9 official, but as I said, there's only one minor difference, so let's take a look at that. So what does this do? This gives us access to be able to insert three types of camera rigs. So if we go Shift A and then go down to camera, we can insert just a plain old camera, or we've got these three rigs here now. We've got a dolly rig, we've got a crane rig, and we've got a 2D camera rig. I'll just quickly show you the 2D camera rig and just look through our camera here. So basically we now have a couple of different controls for this camera. We've got our root control, which is going to move everything around. We've got our little camera control, which offsets it from the root. And then we have these two little controls here, which when we move them around is going to change the actual size of the camera. But it's a 2D camera rig designed to work in 2D, even though when you're working in 3D software. Let's take a look at some of the other ones. So we're going to go Shift A, I'm going to choose a crane rig because the dolly and the crane are almost identical. There's just a few extra bones in the crane rig. Okay, so here we go. We've got our rig here. We can jump into pose mode and then we can actually animate it. So we've got our root control, which moves everything. We have our camera control here. We have our height here, which you can scale, and we have our arm, which you can then scale and rotate. This is going to help you get those arcing crane shots. And most importantly, down here, we have our aim control. So we can just grab this and move it around and animate it to be wherever you want it to be. If we bring up the end panel here and then go to item, you can see we've got some controls down here. We can change the focal length of our camera. Now this is actually a driver that is set on the control here, so you can animate it all within the same object, rather than animating the rig and then animating the camera if you want to do a zoom. Having the two objects combined into one makes it very easy to animate. Here are your clippings, so you can set the start and the end clipping. You can change the type of camera, perspective, orthographic, or panoramic. If you want to enable your depth of field, that's what this one does here. Now, at the moment, there's a couple of ways that we can add a depth of field object. Let me just show you the empty here. So this is our focus point. We can actually animate that if we want. This is our f-stop value here. Or if we want to automate the focal distance, we can just hit this button here, which means that it's now linked to the aim control. So wherever this aim is going to be the point that is perfectly in focus, and the f-stop is obviously going to change your depth of field. Here we can enable or disable the passe-partout, the French word for black bit around the frame, which I can't pronounce correctly. And here we also have the composition guide. So if we want to turn on our safe areas, although all these are very difficult to see inside the viewport, but one that you might find very handy is the rule of thirds. That one there, just that one. Or actually enable or disable any ones that you want. Now, if you want to make the camera unselectable, just click this one. So now when you're in object mode, you can't accidentally select it. It's only going to let you select the rig, which is sometimes very handy. This add marker and bind, what that will do, if you have multiple cameras in your scene, it will add a marker. So if we wanted to do switching cameras, so I'll just quickly add, let's add a dolly rig. And now on this frame, frame 33, I'm going to make that one the active camera. So now if we're looking through here, you can see frame 1, that is our crane rig, and then over here, we're jumping to the other camera. That's what that button does. Now, if you wanted to just make the camera active and it's not active, just hit that button. However, if we have markers here, that is automatically going to override it if we say move the viewport here. That is because it's part of Blender's default behavior. It's going to snap to the whatever value you have for your camera marker. Now, some of the final controls here, if you don't want the aim to follow the control there, you can just turn that off. So now this is independent of that. Let's turn off the depth of field so we don't have that. Turn off my limits. That's just in case you need that functionality, but most of the time you probably have that turned on. And then finally we have these two little controls here, which is just an easy way to set the length of these, which is the same thing as scaling it. Just got the values here. All right, so I've just tidied up my scene here, and I just want to show you the one additional thing that I've added to this version 1.4.4, and that is the fact that we've got an extra bone here to do an offset. Say for example you want to do a rule of thirds. Let's turn on my rule of thirds. You can't see that very well, so let me just change the background. Let's say you want to move this around and have our object in a different position on the screen. Well, what we can do, actually I'll just position that there so it's in the right spot. With this little offset here, we can rotate it to be wherever you want. So I can rotate it, let's just put it on the third lines, and now when we grab our main control, our camera control, it's sticking on that place where we put it rather than being dead in the center. Now the crane rig has that exact same control there, the offset control. So there we go, that's everything you need to know about the Add Camera Rigs add-on. Thanks for watching. Dun dun dun! It's time to do our classic dolly zoom. So this is what we're going to be working on for this exercise. The whole idea of a dolly zoom is you dolly the camera in as you zoom out, or you dolly the camera out as you zoom in. And you're keeping the same amount of screen real estate of your character on the actual view here. So you don't actually have to use the file that I've started with. You can use your own character or your own subject, whatever it is, but you really do want to show the dolly zoom effect. So make sure that you have something in the background that can emphasize that. That is the only thing I would suggest for this exercise. Now you also don't need to be using the camera rig. You can just use a normal camera for this exercise, but I've used it just to practice actually using our camera rig to become more familiar with it. So let's get started with this super fun dolly zoom. All right, so here we are. Now I'm going to add in our camera rigs, but first make sure that we have it enabled. So we're going to go over to my preferences and then type in add. Make sure that add camera rigs is enabled. Also, while I'm here, I'm going to make sure my screencast keys are enabled. They always turn themselves off for some reason. Okay, so now I'm going to add our camera rig. So Shift A, and then we can choose either a crane or a dolly rig. I'm going to choose a dolly rig because there's just a few less bones to deal with. And then I'm going to jump into side view and position it. Now this is also not 100% necessary, but I'm going to position this just by grabbing the whole object and moving the aim so it's on the subject here. This isn't necessary, but it just helps my brain deal with it. I could have moved it in pose mode, but you know, it's one less move that we have to do later on. Okay, so now that we are ready to animate, I'm going to jump into pose mode by hitting tab, choosing pose mode, and they're going to select all our bones. Actually, it doesn't matter if they're not, because I'm going to hit I and make sure that we key them. If we didn't have them selected, we could just choose the whole character. If we do have them selected like what we do now, I'm going to choose whole character, selected bones only. Bang! Now that has keyed all of our all of the channels on our controls here, and it has also keyed our lens settings, which is our zoom value. But before we go any further, let's split our view and actually change one of these to be the view from our camera so we can see what's going on. All right, so when we do a dolly zoom, we're actually dollying in and zooming out, or vice versa, we're zooming out as we dolly in. So when we do this exercise, we can do it either way, but I'm going to start being further away and then pushing the camera in as I zoom out. So it makes sense that I start with the lens setting first. So I've positioned it back here And I'm going to start with a long lens, which is zoomed in, as you've learned. And for this one, I don't want to go above, say, a 300mm lens, which is super zoomed in. Like 300 is a pretty long lens. Also, I want to make sure that I enable my auto keying. So I'm going to turn on my auto keying here and turn on my keying set as well. I prefer to use the available keying set once I've already set that initial keyframe. If you don't set it first, then that one won't work. And also make sure that you enable this button so that it actually sets it on all of the available channels. It uses this setting here. Okay, so now we're ready. We want to take up the same amount of screen space in our two positions. That's being far away and being close. And that is the trick to it. So I'm going to push this camera in a little bit. So just push it in and choose a nice so let's go a little bit more. So this is about just a tiny bit in. This is how much I want to put on screen. I'm also going to shift up our camera just a little bit. I'm going to do that on the root just so that everything moves together. That's kind of where I want it. Remember, our auto keying has automatically set those changes. Okay, so now we're ready for our second keyframe. I want this to take about 50 frames. That's a nice round number. Now, when we push in and we zoom out, we can actually just judge it by eye, or if you're struggling judging it by eye, we can actually use our annotation tool to draw on the screen. And just make sure that we have our show tool settings. So I'm just right clicking here, show tool settings, and then just make sure that the placement of our annotation is on the view. So that way when we zoom in and out, it's actually going to stay in the same spot. So I'm going to just draw some little markers. It doesn't matter, I'm just going to be rough. This is roughly where our head is on the screen here. Now I'm going to go to frame, well, actually I'm already on frame 51 and I am ready to push our camera in. But before we do that, let's set our lens. So 300 was going to be our maximum, and I would suggest not going below, say, a 16, because that's a pretty wide lens for the real world as well. But as you can see, we're now zoomed all the way out, so we need to push our camera in and try and keep the same amount of screen real estate with our head. Now it's not going to, the sides aren't going to match, but I'm looking at the top and the bottom, and that's looking pretty good. So if I just scrub here, see, haha, I have done my dolly zoom. I'm going to get rid of my annotations, so to jump down to the view tab, and then down the bottom annotation, just click the negative just to delete it. So that is the pushing in, and because I want it to loop, I'm going to grab this keyframe here and jump all the way over to frame 101, and a Shift D, duplicate that, stick it on frame 101. Yes, that's the right frame. And they're going to end our animation there as well. So Control End, and now I'm going to play my animation and see how we went. Vroom. There we go. That is our dolly zoom complete. Super duper easy and super duper fun. Only one more thing to do, and that is to render it out. I'm going to render this out to be a video, dolly zoom.mp4, and then make sure that we change this to be, I prefer an MP4 setting. So let's go view and render. Oh, actually, I'm going to, before I render the viewport, I'm going to disable my overlays so we don't see the armature on. Now go view, viewport render animation, and hit Control F11, bring this up on my other screen. There we go. That is our dolly zoom done. And you really see what I mean about the lens compression. So when we go to the wide lens, you can see these squares actually look super far away from each other. It's stretching the view. And when we go to the long lens, it's actually bringing them a lot closer together. That's what I was talking about in the other video when I was mentioning lens compression. Now you know how to do a dolly zoom. I look forward to seeing all of your submissions. Have some fun, people. All right, so let's take a look inside Blender to actually see where all the settings are that affect your camera. So here I am inside the default scene, and the first thing I want to show you is the output resolution for your camera. So here I've got my camera selected, and you might think that you need to select this camera to say, if you wanted to output a 1920 by 1080 resolution, you might be thinking that it's actually part of the camera settings here, but it's not. It's actually tied to the scene output, which is this little printer icon here. So if we change this, you'll see the size of our camera is actually moving here. I'm just going to split my window here. So drag this up. Let's make this a 3D viewport. And I'm going to press the numpad 0 to view through our camera here. Or you could just push this little icon here and it will do exactly the same thing. So if we change this, you can actually see that it is changing the resolution here. But let me just reset that back to default, which is 1920 by 1080. So now this is the default resolution. Now almost everything else to do with the camera is inside the data tab here, which is the green camera icon. Right, now before we jump into the focal lengths and the types of camera, I want to point out that there's a difference between the actual viewport, like how you see the view, and the camera actual focal length, and there's that settings. So I'm going to bring up my panel here. I'll turn on my screencast key so you can see it as well. And inside the view tab, I'll just drag this down so you can see that says view there. You'll see we've actually got the focal length and the clip start and end for our viewport. Now this works exactly the same way as our camera, but it's actually the vantage point that we're looking at our scene from. So if we wanted to zoom in our scene, we would do this. And if we wanted to zoom out, we do this. But bear in mind, the same perspective distortion happens. So say if let's lower this down to a 12mm lens and we go zoom in here. So we've got the same perspective distortion as we had in the previous video. So I wouldn't suggest doing this. I would just leave this at the default 50mm. So you can see it's looking much more natural. And remember, 50mm is equivalent to the human eye. So this is pretty close to how we actually see things. By the way, this is all viewport specific. So if we jump down to this one here, we can go to this viewport and change this one to be 30mm, and it doesn't affect any of the other ones up here. Okay, so let's jump back to our camera view. I'll hit this button here. The clipping start is how close to the camera before things start showing. So if we drag this up, you'll see our cube disappears because it is that is 6 meters from the camera. But let's just undo that. I think it is 0.1, which is 10 centimeters. I actually think that's a little bit too far away. So let's just make it 1 centimeter away. And then it can see 1 kilometer or 1,000 meters into the distance. If we drag this down, I'll just type something in here. Let's make this 10 meters. You'll see, okay, we can't see it. Let's drag it up now. You can see, okay, that is the extent to which we can see. Okay, so that is actually the viewport. Now the same settings for the camera is down here. We've got our clipping start and our clipping end. I don't need to show you that. Although I think the default of 100 meters for the camera is a little bit short. So you might want to start with the default of say 1,000 meters, which is 1 kilometer. That way, if you're dealing with a large scene, you're not going to have it cut off. And you're wondering why you can't see your rolling hills in the background. All right, so let's actually adjust our focal length here, and you can see it's adjusting the way that it displays in our viewport, and it's changing the way we see from our camera vantage point. So that is how we set our zoom here. And if we actually wanted to do our tilt shift, that's what this shift X and Y is. So if we grab our X and drag it here, that is our shift, and then our Y is actually the tilt, where we're going up and down. It's keeping the lens parallel to the sensor, but it's changing the perspective point. So let's just return these back to 0. Okay, so it's actually 3 types of camera inside Blender. There is the perspective camera that we have been looking at. There is the orthographic, which looks a little bit different. And the difference with that is we don't actually have any perspective at all. You can see our cube here is looking very flat. And let's just actually duplicate this cube and move it further away. And if I position our camera here to look around, you see this one in the distance, oops a daisy, this one in the distance isn't smaller because it doesn't have any perspective. But if we change this back to perspective, you'll see now it is smaller because it is further away. That is the difference between the orthographic and the perspective. It's the same thing as when you change our view here from being orthographic or perspective by hitting this little icon here or hitting 5 on the numpad. Okay, so the way that you adjust the scale of our orthographic camera is this setting here. So we've just got a scale, and you can see what it's doing here. It's just making that bigger or smaller. And once again, the thing that is further in the background is actually the same physical size. There is no perspective at all. So let me just show you one more thing about this. If we actually get closer, it's not changing the perspective at all. But if we go past that object, it will disappear based on our clipping setting, as we've already learned. Now the other camera, I won't be going over in great detail. That is the panoramic view. Now let me just set up something quite quickly. I'm just going to grab one here and duplicate it. Let's make this a really wide perspective. You can see what that's done to our view here. Now it's worth pointing out that the viewport doesn't display correctly for the actual render. And when you want to use a panoramic camera, the only engine that will work with it is Cycles engine. So if we go over to our render settings here, the render engine is set to Eevee. A panoramic camera will not work. We have to jump over to the Cycles, and remember this viewport, it can't really display the panoramic view. So we have to actually render it. So let's just go viewport render image. So you can see this render here is actually how it should look, where the viewport can't physically display this. All right, so let's return things back to normal by going back to our perspective view. Now the lens unit here, you can actually decide to show it in the angle of view. That is like how much it can see, like how wide. And this is a very difficult way of thinking about it in my view, except if you are needing to do a panoramic view, then actually just setting it, I want it to be 173, which happens to be the maximum. That is how much we're going to see. So that is all the way out here to here. That is your field of view. And excuse the writing, I was drawing with my mouse. All right, so moving on from all the lens settings, we're going to go into the depth of field. Now this can be a little bit tricky to turn on. So the first thing we need to do is make sure that we enable it for our camera. I'm in the camera data here. And we also then need to, if you want to see it in the viewport, you need to enable it for the viewport. Now you need to be in the shading mode first, and then bring up our little menu here and go down to here, and you see a depth of field. So now you can see we've got some blur going on, and that's now also active in the other mode. So in material preview as well as the rendered mode. It does not blur when you're in wireframe, but that would be a really weird thing if it did. So now I can actually see my blur, but it's difficult to actually tell what's going on in my viewport unless you enable the few of the viewport display settings. We're going to go down in our tab here to viewport display. I'm going to turn on my limits here, and now you can see, aha, we've got this little widget here that tells me where my focal plane is going to be. As you've learnt, we can actually set that value in a few different ways. We can actually animate this and then make change it to be, okay, our focal plane is there, or we can set it to be an object. So I'm just going to click the eyedropper here and just click this cube here, and now you'll see one of those cubes, whichever one that I've selected, I think it was that one, is going to be the point of focus. Let me just undo that and then talk about our f-stop. So I'm going to bring this here so you can see we've got a nice focal point of being our lady here. Let me bring up our... Okay, so the f-stop, as you've learnt, controls how much in focus or not. Now this is a little bit easier to see. I've got this little add-on which I've found online. I will include the link for this in the description for the video, but bear in mind this isn't maintained by me, it's maintained by someone else, so you don't actually need this. It just helps visualize what's going on. So here we've got the start of the point that is perfectly in focus and the end of the point that is reasonably in focus. So that's my area of interest. So we can change the focal point here. Oh, sorry, not that one, the focal distance. That's what the f-stop does. It's also worth pointing out that the more blur that you have displaying in your scene, the slower it is going to go. Now the blades, the rotation, and the ratio are all going to affect the way that it blurs. Now the way something blurs is referred to as the bokeh, which is a Japanese word meaning the way things blur. There's two ways of pronouncing it in Japanese. Now, I'm not an expert, but there is bokeh, where it goes up at the end, and there is bokeh, where it goes down at the end. But in the West, we butcher that word and we say it however we want. So often you hear it pronounced as bokeh or bok or bokkers or even Steve. That's a lie. I just made that one up. So don't worry about the word. It just means the way stuff blurs. And the blades, the rotation, and the ratio affect the shape of that bokeh or bokkers, if you will. So remember our iris, how it had the blades on it? This is going to simulate how many blades that it has. And the more it has, the more circular it becomes. It just affects the shape. And the rotation is going to spin it clockwise around that. And the ratio, I'm not going to pretend I know what it does, but the little description here says it gives you the anamorphic lens bokeh distortion. I just said bokeh and I should have said bokkers, but you know what I mean. That's what all these settings do. But I'm going to hazard a guess and say you're probably going to leave those at the default. So I'm going to disable that depth of field, and then we're going to move on to our camera settings. So the camera settings, this is the size of your sensor. So as we've learnt, you only need to adjust the sensor if you are needing to emulate a specific type of camera. So by that I mean, if you click in your menu here, this is an iPhone 4 or an iPhone 4S or a red one. This is only useful if you're trying to match some footage or something like that. If you're not trying to do anything of that sort, just leave it at Auto 36, which is a default setting. And as you've already learned, it is based on the actual digital SLR cameras, and before that, the actual analog version of the film cameras. But if we adjust this, it's kind of like we're adjusting our zoom. And technically you're not, but you can think about it as that's really what it's doing. So let's just leave that at the default 36 because it's a scary thing to play with. All right, let's turn on our safe areas. Now, by default, you can't really see these little lines here. But let me just change our view. Jump over here and let's change our viewport, make it a little lighter. And you can see these dotted lines. So these are our safe margins, and you can set these here. This is for titles and action safe. You want to keep things visible in your viewport to make sure that older televisions and whatnot can actually see them. Chances are you probably won't need them in today's digital age unless you're doing something for television broadcast or something of that effect. That's what these settings are here. And you've also got some alternate ones here, which is the center title ones. But let me just turn them off, clean up our view. Now let's get stuck into the viewport display. So we can actually display how big this icon is here with this little handy slider. We can change the size up, but don't go too big because then it's a little bit cumbersome and gets in your way. And you can decide whether you want to turn your limits on, the mist, so you can see the start and the end of the mist. If you're doing some compositing, the mist pass can be very handy. This is going to show your sensor size. You can see it here very faintly around our around our viewport here. But you probably don't need that one. Now the name just shows you when you're looking through the camera, you can see what camera you're looking for, which is sometimes very handy. And also we have our composition guides. So one thing that you might use quite often would be the rule of thirds, which would be this one here. So you click this one on and you can see it's divided into 9 squares, which gives you these lines here, which will help you compose your frame. I'll be talking a little bit more about that in a later video. And finally, we have the passepartout, which means matte. It's a French word, which explains exactly why I just butchered the word. This is the color on the outside of your view here. So if we turn it off, you'll see we don't see any color. If we turn it on, we can then control the opacity. Now, I find it's pretty handy to have this at, say, 50%, but then when you're getting down to the final details, turning this up really does help block out any action that's off screen, because that can actually trick your mind and thinking that it's actually on the screen when it's not. So that's a very handy thing to adjust when you're in the final stages of animation. So what if you have multiple cameras in your scene? How do you tell Blender which camera that you want to actually render from? Well, there's a few ways to do that. As with many things in Blender, there's always many different ways. If we go over to the scene settings over here, the one that looks like the 3 objects, you've got your camera up here. And you can choose whatever camera that you want, camera 1, camera 2, camera 3. And if we choose that, you'll see that this one is now filled in, and this one is the active camera. And you can see that is respected up here because we can see our blue ball here. Although while I'm here, let's just turn that onto object. We get our colors. It makes it a little bit easier to see. So another way of doing that is, say if I want this one to be active, I can just hit Control numpad 0, and that will jump to the view and it will also make it active. We can do the same thing from the menu up here. If we go, I'll just choose this one here and go View. If we go to Camera, we can jump to the active camera with the numpad 0, or we can set the active object as the camera. So there we go. Now we can see through that red one there. And remember, if we want to jump back to the normal view, just hit this on here. That's how we change them. What if we want to change them while our animation is playing? Well, we can do that by binding the camera here. So I have my timeline down here. If I go to marker, you can see I've got a shortcut here, bind camera to markers. So I can click that, and then we get a little camera marker here. And this says on frame 1, I want Blender to use this camera. So let's go to a different frame. Let's go to frame 21, and let's use the shortcut this time, which is Control B, and we need to have our mouse over here because that will do something different up here. So that is camera 2, and then on frame 41 we're going to do the same thing. Mouse down here, Control B. Now when we play our animation, you can see it's actually changing the cameras as we scrub through, and we can move these around as well. So if we want to move this here or even change the order, now we're changing the different order. And if we want to duplicate them, that's also possible as well. So if I want camera 2 to be here, and then I hit Shift D and duplicate it over here. And let's go camera 3, camera 2, camera 3, camera 2. I'm just duplicating. So now when we do this, you can see we scrub through and just flipping backwards and forwards. That's how we deal with our switching cameras. If we want to delete them, just select them all with the mouse over the little black strip here, and then hit the X key, delete the markers. So now they're all gone. But remember, that has changed our little settings here. So I'll show you one final way that we can set it. If we have no camera set, we can just hit the icon here, which is the eyedropper, and then just choose our camera. That is all the ways that you can set your camera. There's probably more that I don't know about, but there's many different ways to do the same thing. So we can actually change the settings of our camera from the viewport here if we have certain things enabled. So I'm going to select my camera here, and you can see when my mouse hovers over the end of the camera here, it's changing colors. So if I left click, I can drag that, and that's an alternate way of changing the zoom. Although I wouldn't suggest that you do it that way because you've got no real precise control over it. I find it's always better to use the settings here, so that way you can set it to be exactly what you want. And there's one other final thing that you can do, and that is you can change the focal point with these mouse manipulators if you have it enabled. So let's just go over to our viewport display, turn on our limits, and now when I hover over my mouse here, you can see it's gone green. If I left click, I can now drag and change that as well. The Blender camera can be manipulated any other way that an object inside 3D can. I've just got my little manipulator here. We can actually rotate it, and that will rotate the way that the camera is pointing. So we can go on any of the axes. We can translate it with our manipulators here on any of the axes. But if we scale it, it's only going to change the way it displays. It's not going to do anything to the way that it actually renders your image. Now, trying to position your camera like that can be a little bit tricky. So there's a few ways to make it easier. If we just go over to the View tab here, I've got too many tabs open, so you can't quite read that one. But under the View lock here, we can lock the camera to the view. So I'll actually do it in this one here. I'm gonna lock the camera to the view. And now when I rotate around, I'm just manipulating the viewport in the way that I want it to, and it's moving the camera in my scene. That's a good way to position it if you're just using a camera and not using a camera rig. And if you only needed to do a still render or a still shot, this would probably be a good way of doing it. But also get into the habit of turning this off straight away, because what you'll find is you'll go to move the camera again and you'll be like, oh, I didn't mean to move it. So just make sure that you get into the habit of turning it on and off. In addition to that, we also have fly and walk mode. So that is in our view up here. Actually, I'll enable it from our viewport here. We can go view down to navigation, and you can see we've got fly navigation and walk navigation. They work very similar, but one's going to walk along the ground where one can fly freely in the air. So I'll just choose walk for now. And you can see my mouse, when I move it around, it's going to position the way that it's looking. And if I hit the regular keys that you're used to, the W, S, A, D, on your keyboard, you can actually walk it around. This is kind of like a first person shooter. And if you wanted to transport, you can push a spacebar or the middle mouse click, and that's going to teleport you to where the crosshairs are. Now you can scroll up to increase the speed that it's going to move, and scroll down to decrease the amount of speed that it's going to move. Now just escape that. Now fly mode works exactly the same way, except you're not constrained to the ground, so you can actually fly around. There's actually more keys that you can use. I'll just bring up the manual here. So if you go to the Blender manuals and just type in walk mode or fly mode, you'll get this page here, and it'll show you all the other buttons. So an easy way to find that is you just go to the help and go manual. That's going to bring it up here, and then just type in walk mode. There we go, walk, fly, navigation, and that is the menu there. Now, if you need to do any type of fancy movement with your camera, I would suggest using a camera rig. Now, I'll just show you how to insert one into your scene here, but then I'll have a separate video which explains in detail how to use it. We hit Shift A and we have the add-on enabled. We just go down to camera and we can choose a dolly rig, a crane rig, or a 2D camera. We'll be using these two this course. So just use the crane rig, and now we can jump into pose mode for our armature here, and we can actually aim our camera exactly where we want, position it, and move them all around. So if you need to do anything fancy, I would suggest using a camera rig. It's going to make your life a lot easier. But as I said, that's going to be part of a separate video. Alrighty, I think that's everything you need to know about your cameras. Now let's have some fun playing around with them. How the visual elements are arranged in the frame is called the composition. Now there's a heap to study about this topic and I'm barely going to be able to scratch the tip of the iceberg. And I'm pretty sure that's the correct saying. If not, it is now. Anyway, what I plan to do in this lesson is teach you a few of the essential things about composing your shot that are going to give you the greatest bang for your buck, so to speak. I'd like to show you some really basic examples and talk about the lead room, rule of thirds, plus I'll analyze a real project that I worked on while throwing in a tip or two. So let's scratch that iceberg. Here is a still image of our beloved Baker character. Now this area above his head is called the headroom. I'll speak about that in a moment. But this area towards his nose is called the lead room. And that is because he is looking in that direction. It's also called the nose room or lead space. I prefer the term lead room though. Now lead room is very important, especially if your character is moving, which I'll show you an example of in a moment. But here our character is looking to the screen left, so it's best that we actually move him over to the screen right so that he has more lead room. This feels more natural, especially if he was in a conversation with somebody else. So here's an example of a moving character. This is Red Nelp and he is running dead center in the frame and it doesn't quite feel right. That is because he doesn't have enough lead room. Let me emphasize this by making this a little bit more awkward. If I move him to the screen right, it feels like he doesn't know where he's going and he could run into something. But if I position him back to give him more lead room, it feels much more natural and fun. Now we're looking at another portrait shot of Baker, and can you guess what type of lens I'm using? That's right, 85mm. So here we have our Baker and his eyes are dead center in the middle of the frame. So for something like this is way too much headroom. So what we want to do is move him up on the frame to make him look a little bit better. Although this has gone slightly too far. We don't have enough headroom. So let's just position him down a little bit. So his eyes are about 1/3 of the way down from the top. So this is a good amount of headroom and the shot looks pretty good. So now let's push in. So I've pushed the camera in and we've lost all that headroom. Is that a bad thing? No, because this is now a close-up shot, but his eyes are still 1/3 of the way down, which makes it look very natural. Now let's go even further. Okay, so we've lost the top of his head altogether. We're still keeping his eyes that 1/3 of the way down. This is because of the rule of thirds. So what is this rule of thirds I've mentioned a couple times now? Well, it's a composition notion that encourages us to avoid putting the subject directly in the center of the frame. How do we do that? Here's an image. Let's slice the vertical into thirds, and we'll also slice the horizontal into thirds. Now we have 9 segments. If we place something of importance along these lines, it's generally going to make a more appealing composition. And if we can put something of interest at one of these points where the lines cross, like say the character's eyes, that's a bonus. However, this is just a guide. There is a little bit of wiggle room. In a still image like this, everything stays perfectly put. But in your animated film, things are going to be moving around. The character is going to move and the camera is going to move. So things can't, and they shouldn't, stay perfectly lined up with these composition rules. Plus, the rule of thirds isn't the only composition rule that is out there. There's the golden ratio, golden triangles, leading lines, diagonals, triangles, frames in frames, and more. But the rule of thirds is probably the one that you need to know. And it's really easy to use once you understand it. If your character is moving to the right, then it makes sense to put him on the left. If your character is looking to the left, it makes sense to put them on the right. Plus, if you get the character's eyes in one of those points, that's a bonus. But as I said, all of this stuff is just a guide and it shouldn't be referred to as a rule, because sometimes you do just need to have the subject in the center of the frame. It's all well and good for me to explain some of these things on mostly still examples. So let's have a look at a real project I worked on a few years ago. This was a TV commercial for an African alcoholic drink. I was responsible for the rigging and the animation. Now I didn't actually do the previs or the layout camera work, but I did animate the final camera. And I want to show you some of this stuff that I've been talking about in action and how we can't always line things up perfectly when things are moving around. But anyway, let's take a look.
panache melallo.
Now that we've had a look at it, let's go back to the start and I'll just point out a few things with some drawovers as we go. So in our first frame, and everything is in the dead center, and that is okay. This is our establishing shot, and we're just establishing where we are. We're in a bowl of lemons. We scrub forward a little bit. Yeah, so we're dead in the center, and that's okay. Over here, you can see I've got a little bit of an anticipation before the door opens, and all our lemons fall out. Now that opening happens around the midline. You can see that's where all the lemons are falling out. That's okay. Next shot, they're moving down and we've got some leading lines there. That's just the nature of a point of view shot. Then we have our hero lemon. He's a little bit left behind, but you can see he jumps onto the screen at the 1/3 mark. We want to give him some lead room because he's jumping off that way. And then in our next shot, because in the last one he was jumping from screen left to right, I have to continue that movement from screen left to right. Otherwise, we're crossing the line, and you'll learn a little bit more about that later on. And that's because the director wanted this shot, this one to go that way. So that's one little trick that I did to avoid it. I just kept him moving in the same direction on the screen. So anyway, we're going down. Let's just fast forward a little bit. These guys are jumping off here. Now here's a total mistake. This guy just stops. That was not my fault. I swear I handed it off to them and he was moving, but in the final product, he just stands still like that. Oh well. Here you can see these lemons are landing, and they're all landing in about the 1/3 of the way in. That's our hero lemon there. Jumping off here, we've got our 2 points of interest, and they're about the 1/3 of the way in on each of these. Now here, the main action is about the 1/3 of the way in for our hero lemon, around there, to give him a little bit more lead space to show that he still has room to move on the screen, right? Here is the door closing. We want this main action. We want the hit to occur almost in the middle. That was planned so that we can see as this lemon rolls off behind. You got more space there. We're getting closer. Now here we want to show him speeding up, so we reduce that lead space by accelerating him forward. Here he squeezes through in slow motion, and boom, we want him to spend the most amount of time in this sweet spot up here, which is where the lines cross. And we have a final pack shot. He starts at the bottom left, and you can see that is 1/3 of the way in, and the camera takes a few frames. There's a few frames of lag before the camera follows. And that was intentional because I wanted it to feel like a real person was animating this camera, and the character even leaves the frame. That's because our cameraman was too slow to get up there. And we also want to pay attention to the main thing, which is this is the pack shot. So the most important thing is the product at the end here, where it ends in the dead center, and that is okay for it to be in a dead center as well. Hopefully that's helped explain a few things. Now before I go, I just want to reiterate a couple of the points before we move on to the next video. So first of all, when it makes sense, don't put your subject in the dead center of the frame. Remember the leading space, especially if your character is moving. You want to give them some space to move into. And also think about the fact that a person has to move your camera. The camera shouldn't always perfectly follow the subject because the camera operator doesn't know how the subject's going to move. There's always going to be a little bit of lag for reaction time. However, some movements can be predicted. All right, that's enough for now. I'll see you in the next video. The 180-degree rule catches a lot of people out because sometimes they don't even know that there is a rule, but understanding it will keep your viewer from being confused when your camera cuts within the same scene. So what is it? Let me show you. Here's a top view of our two baker characters, Blue Baker and Orange Baker, and we're going to draw an imaginary line between these two characters here. Now when you cut from one shot to the next, if your camera stays on the same side of this line, 180 degrees from this line, then those cuts are going to make sense. It can be anywhere. It can be over here. It can be over here. It doesn't really matter. Everything will make sense. But if your camera goes across to the other side, you have crossed the line. There are times when you want to do this intentionally, but you really need to know the rules before you break them. But let me show you why this is a bad idea. Here we have Baker on the screen right, and he's looking to the screen left. Let's just imagine him talking to our Blue Baker. Blah, 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 blah. Then we cut to our Blue Baker, and he's going, yes, Orange Baker, in a reaction shot. Then if we cut back to Orange Baker, and our camera's on the wrong side,
Ugh. See how awkward that feels? We have crossed the line. When the camera is on the other side of this line, it makes it appear like Baker is now looking in a different direction. And this is really jarring to the viewer because it will take their brain a little bit longer to figure out what's going on. Did Blue Baker change colors? Is it a time jump? Is it the same scene? Oh, yes, it is, but something just feels off. What? Anyway, moving on. Those are the little thousands of questions that go through the brain at the speed of thought. But if the camera flips back and forth on the same side of this line, the characters will always be looking in the same direction on the screen, and it will be super easy to follow. I mentioned briefly in the other video about keeping the movement going in the same direction when cutting on the action. And that's for the same reason. If the character was moving screen right on the cut and he changes directions on the next shot, it's going to be really jarring for the audience to try and follow what's going on because the camera has crossed that imaginary line. So it's always best to continue that movement in the same direction. So let's recap. The 180-degree rule is simple. Draw an imaginary line between your characters and keep your camera cuts on the same side of this line and you'll be sweet.